when we moved after university, we moved down to Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina, and we got set up at a church called the Summit Church, which is a church there led by a guy named J.D. Greer. And that was paradigm shifting for us because the sending culture that church, I think, is known for. It allowed us to really understand what it means to put your yes on the table and not tell, and then let God put it on the map. Not you saying yes, but only in these places.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sowers Podcast. My name is Matt Naismith, and I am your host. This podcast is all about church planting in the Canadian context. So whether you are a church planter, pastor in a church, part of a church planting team, or someone just wanting to learn more about Canadian church planting, we believe this podcast is for you. We pray this is a blessing to you, and if it is, we would ask you to share links to episodes, subscribe on whatever platform you're using. With that, let's get to our next conversation. Welcome, friends, to the Sowers Podcast. My hope and prayer is that this conversation and this episode would help inspire you to become a sower of the gospel in the places where you live, work, learn, and play. And so wherever you are listening to this episode, a special welcome to you. Well, hey, last week I heard from someone who said that this podcast has been deeply hopeful and encouraging for them as it relates to the Canadian church, hearing stories from across the country of things that God is doing in some places that are more obviously seen and in other places that are less obvious to the naked eye and to social media feeds. If you, like this person, want to share with how this podcast has been an encouragement to you, how it's challenging and equipping you to become a sower, or it's just generally impacting your perspective on the Canadian church, why don't you go ahead and email ask@thesowerspod.ca. Once again, that's ask@thesowerspod.ca, or you can engage with us on X or on Instagram at the Sowers Pod. Once again, that is at the Sowers Pod. In this episode, you're going to hear a conversation that I had with Chad MacDonald and Jeremy Dager of Port City Church in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Port City Church exists to help people encounter Jesus and follow his way. They see Halifax as a strategic city to fulfill the mission that God has given us. Halifax is home to one of the largest natural ports in the world, which means that at 71 meters deep, God created Halifax as a strategic outpost for importing and exporting. Chad and Jeremy talk about their experience of planting together in team. Jeremy talks about coming up from the United States, and Chad shares about his history in the Atlantic provinces. I think you're going to be encouraged, challenged, and as always, equipped. And so without further ado, here is my conversation with Chad MacDonald and Jeremy Dager of Port City Church in Halifax. Chad and Jeremy, thank you so much for joining the Sowers Podcast. It's great to have you both on. I would love for each of you to have an opportunity to share your individual dreams for a church and the planting of a church in Atlantic Canada. So Chad, why don't you start with that, your individual dream of a church in Atlantic Canada?
I think a dream for Port City Church, or even if you rewind the tape a little bit and we talk about why we started Port City, or I had a vision to start Port City individually. I would answer that just to simply put, I think a church that is around for not just a few years, but is around for a few generations. And I often will say, I want to plant a church that's for my children's children's children. And so I think we're in a region where there's many churches that are dying and declining. I think there's a huge need for more gospel-centered churches. And then even in church planting over the years, we've seen churches planted, but the average lifespan probably of those churches has been under 5 or 6 years. And so we've seen church plants. We've seen churches planted, but then we've seen many of those church plants not continue. And so I think, just simply put, a dream of mine would be to see a church that's around for generations and for years and for my children's children's children.
And for you, Chad, you grew up in Atlantic Canada, so you've been there a long time. Left for a little bit, came back. Uh, did you imagine when you came back being part of a church plant to reach Atlantic Canada? You obviously saw the need.
Yeah, at first I definitely had more of a negative feeling towards the church in Atlantic Canada, doing ministry out west for many years. And being from Atlantic Canada, so when we came back, I was more in a church planting catalytic role and didn't see myself starting a church, nor did I necessarily want to. But then I think after being back home, several years had passed, and I think we just, probably the way we would articulate it, we just felt that there was a huge need for more churches, a particular kind of church, which I won't get into in this moment. But this, a holy discontent is how I would word it, for the region and for the spiritual climate of Atlantic Canada.
And how about for you, Jeremy? When did the dream come into your mind of a church in Atlantic Canada?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it probably didn't start as a dream as much as it did a thought. But I think it was around the same time that we were a part of planting a church in North Carolina. We were seeing God do a lot of things, particularly amongst the demographic of young adults, kind of young adults and like early, like young families. And simultaneously, I had, my family who's from PEI, from Prince Edward Island, who were in a similar demographic. And just like seeing the landscape of people in that demographic here, like exiting the church while being a part of a church that was seeing people come in, and that kind of thought began to permeate and just stir. And in some ways, this felt like more of a thorn in my side because I just couldn't get rid of it, but I didn't know what to do with it, and that really kind of lasted for, all of 9 years, through many conversations with different people, and a lot of prayer. And so that's where the inception of it. I think now that we're here, and I still, in a lot of ways, feel like I'm in the learning phase of understanding the context, but I feel like as I'm here and seeing the realities of church life in Atlantic Canada and learning a lot from Chad and other local pastors, I think the dream here is can we create, through the Holy Spirit, obviously, can we create healthy, sustainable churches that are also contextual? Healthy, I mean that in like the most biblical sense, that understand the health of eldership and the biblical teaching and all the things that the Bible equips us to in terms of establishing a local church. Sustainable, meaning, yeah, like what Chad said, like that can stand on their own 2 feet, that understand some of the core principles and the systems and structures of building, for lack of a better term, like a healthy organization. And out of that, like, healthy things produce healthy things. Like we know this principle to be true, like whether it's in agriculture, like a healthy tree produces healthy fruit, and so if we can see churches that are, healthy, sustainable, and contextual, like that understand like the changing climate of particularly Atlantic Canada, then they will produce and reproduce healthy things. So I think that's kind of where I've started to dream, and as I've kind of planted our feet here.
Jeremy, for you, there was this thorn in your side of this thought of planting something in Atlantic Canada. For you, Chad, you were in Atlantic Canada in a catalyst role. You identified, it'd be so good to have a certain type of church here that you really felt would really reach the culture. So how did God knit your two stories together? Because now you're sitting here as co-pastors of a church that has been planted in Halifax in Atlantic Canada. So how did God knit your two stories together?
For me, as we started to move into that call and felt like the Lord was actually leading us to act on it, I looked up the Send Network contact for Atlantic Canada, and it happened to be this guy named Chad MacDonald. So God in his providence brought us together because Chad had just stepped into that role, and I'll let him speak to that. But that's how God knit our stories together. Is I emailed Chad and said, "Hey, I feel like the Lord is prompting me and my family to do something about this burden. I don't know what that is, and but I feel like I need to talk to someone about it, and you're the name here that says I'm supposed to talk to you." So, the Chad can kind of elaborate and talk a little bit more about what that looked like from there.
Yeah, so for you, Chad, you're serving as a catalyst in Atlantic, Canada. I mean, that's just as a catalyst myself. I mean, that's the money email where it's like, yeah, someone's reaching out to me to plant a church in my area. What were some of your initial thoughts and impressions of this email and of this guy from North Carolina?
Actually, he was emailing because he was pretty set, maybe set, I don't know if that's the right word, but his heart was set towards planting in Prince Edward Island. So that's how the conversation began. It was not a conversation that started around Halifax. We began to spend more and more time, you know, digitally connecting. And we realized that there was a special like relationship between us, and then that began to form even between our wives. And then we quickly realized there was a lot of similarities in our experiences in ministry, our philosophy of ministry, our theology, our leadership experience. And so we realized like, wow, there's a lot of like commonality, but yet a lot of healthy difference as well. Very different, a lot of differences in gifting and abilities. That carried on for probably several months. And then at one stage, I just really felt compelled, I would even say like compelled by the Holy Spirit to just ask Jeremy and Julianne, and both Linda and I kind of asked them, would you consider Halifax rather than PEI? And it was just like really clear to me that to have them come to a hub like Halifax, one of the fastest growing cities in Canada, and we love Prince Edward Island. It's a great province, and it's, Jeremy has family that's from there. And our hope is to do a work at some point in Prince Edward Island. But just this idea that Halifax is a better strategic outpost to start and to really establish something, as Jeremy's talked about, that's healthy and hopefully, Lord willing, lasting. So ask them that, and then kind of pitch that vision to them, to lean into this together, to co-lead together. And they went away and took some time. I think it was over an American Thanksgiving, and came back after that weekend and just really felt God's sense of affirmation. And they just said, we're in. So that was it.
And for you, Jeremy, as you're in email correspondence with this Chad from Atlantic, Canada, I'm sure you jumped on a Zoom call at some point, and then, you're sort of courting one another in some sense towards planting in PEI. And then he says, hey, what about Halifax? What was your and your wife's initial response to that? And what were some of the, as you were discerning that, then what were some of the things that you were praying that God would affirm in that sort of change of direction?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because even all along, like in our conversations between my wife and I, like we have been blessed to be a part of a couple ministries that I think have shaped the way we think about these decisions. So, when we moved after university, we moved down to Raleigh, Durham, North Carolina, and we got set up at a church called the Summit Church, which is a church there led by a guy named Dager. And that was paradigm shifting for us, because the sending culture that church, I think, is known for, it allowed us to really understand what it means to put your yes on the table and not and then let God put it on the map, not you saying yes, but only in these places. And so and that even was true when we moved to Greensboro, which is about an hour and a half down the road in North Carolina to plant. Like, I don't think where we planted was something where we would say like, yes, that's where we want to go. It was, we were open to doing what God was calling us to do, which is be a part of a church plant, allowing him to then determine where to place that. So I think God has been worked. We have been worked. God's worked that into us, in our spiritual journey as a part of these ministries that we've been a part of. So I think as a result of that, like, he really prepared us, for these types of conversations. So it wasn't like, oh my gosh, like Halifax, like, I can't believe like that's like this major detour. We almost in some ways expected, like what Paul says, like he's on his way to Rome and God detours him to Macedonia or whatever. It's like we almost expected God to do something like that. And so in the discernment phase for us, like Pastor JD at the summit used to always say, like, hey, don't try not to make a why list, make a why not list, because there's a lot more telling. And I think on that trip back, I remember us driving back from my parents in Philadelphia down to North Carolina, and we talked for 9 hours about that and prayed about it. There was just no like compelling, like, we shouldn't do it for this reason. We just felt like the Lord was just kind of confirming in our spirit and through conversations with different people, and a lot of just the practicality of it, like the nature of Halifax and what Chad had kind of shared with us and the vision for this city. We just felt like the Lord was just clear and just, hey, this is where you're going, And so, yeah, so that was it for us.
So you guys were then on this trajectory to potentially plant together in Halifax. But then another big part of the discerning process is fit and personality. Like, okay, we'll consider Halifax, but now I've got to consider you more intentionally. And so what were some of the things that you guys did individually that then supported a collective together to be assessing one another's personality and your fits with one another in leading Port City?
Yeah, I mean, there was a bunch of stuff. I mean, some simple answers are you got to spend a lot of time together. That's hard to do when you're in different countries, but with technology, it's somewhat possible. But even like me going down to North Carolina, spending time with Mercy Hill, and Mercy Hill's the church that Jeremy was a part of, and that it was a massive part in planting Port City and sent him out. So me spending time with that team and getting to know their leaders, and I mean, simple things like I think we had people like do references on one another.
Mm-hmm.
Jeremy spoke with a bunch of people that I highly respect and other pastors in Canada that I've either worked under or whatnot. So a lot of conversations, a lot of like, you just have to be so open and honest about everything. We joke about it. It is like a bromance. It's like you are courting somebody into a very serious working relationship that, I mean, there's organizational work and then there's ministry. And so it's when you're making all the decisions together, it's very much like a marriage in some senses. So there's just everything needs to be so open and honest. And I would say a massive piece for us is the giftings. And I'll let Jeremy speak to even like, I think a huge tool that's been helpful to us is like the Clifton Strength Finders. And I know that's been huge. Do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, because I think, you think about like a marriage in sense, like it's not that you go in perfectly aligned. It's just knowing to the degree that you can, like what to expect, And I think that's what we were trying to do is uncover that. So one of the things we did was we, both leaned into the Clifton Strength Finders. There's all kinds of good tests. There's all kinds of good things out there that help kind of you understand yourself more and how God's wired you. And so this is one of those tools that we had been using at Mercy Hill, the church that I was on staff at. And so we leaned a little bit more heavily into that. There was a gentleman on staff at Mercy Hill who was actually trained coach through Gallup. And so he worked with us, and that allowed us to be able to see the nature of, collaborating. The kind of the stage before that usually is competition. And so we wanted to make sure that we didn't get stuck there, because our giftings they're different, and that's how God has created it in a good way, in a healthy way. How can those collaborate versus compete? And so through a lot of coaching, which we're still doing, we were able to kind of use that tool to kind of help discern how we can move forward together in the best way possible. So
in my experience in ministry thus far, especially as planting, I had a team, but it was more of a solo leader. You've both spoken about the nature of your personalities, and sometimes those personalities and giftings are quite obvious. At other times, though, I would say maybe you have a deficiency that it's more of a competency rather than a particular strength. How have each of you been able to submit to one another with areas of your personalities that are competencies, not obvious strengths? Because a solo leader would just be able to live off some competency, like sort of base level ability. But in your situation, I'd imagine that there are certain places like your just base level competencies that you just go, you know what, I got to give that up to the other person rather than trying to tackle it myself. So how has that process gone? And is that a helpful kind of way of assessing some things that you've had to give away through working with one another?
That's a daily thing for us. It's difficult when you're leading and making decisions together. And thankfully, I would start by saying, like, I think if anybody's considering this kind of leadership dynamic, I think it is massive to, there has to be agreement and familiarity on a lot of like how you think about ministry. So even practically, like how you structure a Sunday gathering or a service, it could be vastly different, like from just really practical things. Okay, we want it to be more, from a production standpoint, or more from like a low key standpoint, or like all the different components that you're thinking about for Sunday morning. Like if you're on different pages on that stuff, like you are going to have massive challenges where I feel like, I think you would agree, like we're like 80% of like a lot of the philosophy of ministry, how we envision things, what we hope for the future of Port City, how we think about marketing and team and all of those things, that we're most of the way there in agreement. So that's really, really critical when you're thinking about fit. But it's never perfect. You can never get it to be 100%, like in a marriage. It's never 100% agreement. And I just think then you need to rely on the strength of that individual. So, if we're at a headfall, or we're at an impasse with a decision, it's like I need to trust, if that's an area that Jeremy is stronger in, I need to probably lay that down and go with his decision on that, and vice versa for him. And then I think there's also times where you're just not sure who's stronger, and you tend to butt heads, and pride gets in the way. And that's where you just need to be really quick to be mindful of that, and to repent of that. I think, the age old, like keeping short accounts, I think is just massive in this situation. Even if we're feeling something and we just know it, like we could see each other, like, hey man, like what's going on? Like there's something you're not telling me here, and there's just has to be so many frequent conversations that maybe in another leadership setting, if there's one person in charge and you're the second or the third, you maybe just avoid. You maybe just don't bring them up, or you don't sort of crack them open. And in our scenario, there's no room for that. So everything has to be every stone has to be unturned.
Friends, we'll get back to my conversation with Chad MacDonald and Jeremy Dager in just a moment. Prior to that, however, I want to let you know about the C3 Canadian Campus Collective. They believe that college and university students are the most strategic population in Canada to reach. There are over 400 public and private colleges and universities across the country, which represents over 2 million students. And so the opportunity is great. C3 exists to support and strengthen churches and campus ministries to engage the campus, make disciples of Jesus, and plant new things within reach of every campus across Canada together. Their focus areas are engaging the campus, making disciples of Jesus, and planting new things. If you want to learn more about the C3 Canadian Campus Collective, you can visit canadiancampuscollective.ca. Once again, that is canadiancampuscollective.ca. And now back to my interview with Chad and Jeremy. I was wondering if each of you would be willing to share something that you've had to sacrifice or give up for the other person so that they can thrive, and at the same time, they've given something up so that probably you can thrive in a new way. Jeremy, what would one thing be for you?
I think in a lot of ways, like you're giving up, and I say this for me, but I think it's mutual here, but like you're giving up like your name and face as like the face of the organization, the face of the church. And I'm not saying that's wrong. Like I know, that's a lot of churches, they operate that way. But I would say like, there's a degree to which like in my pride, when I'm struggling, like on days where I feel like my sin is like, God says it can is crouching at my door. Like it's, like giving up my face, as the face of the organization, and it's just like, oh, I'm just going to die to that, so.
How about for you, Chad? It might be a mutual sacrifice, but what's something for you?
Oh man, it's hard to think of another answer other than the one Jeremy just said. I mean, that is just the day. It's a real struggle, you know. And as Jeremy would be the primary communicator on a Sunday morning, and so I think people just, naturally think, well, the person who preaches is kind of to use that term, lead pastor, is carrying the vision, is carrying the organization or the ministry, and our structure is very different than that. And so, that's something that I still wrestle with and have to put to death. And it's pride is what it is. It's wanting to be recognized. It's wanting to be seen. It's an idol that we need to constantly dismantle, So, I would say that one for me as well, similarity to Jeremy is huge. And it's just, I mean, it's like we like to say it like, oh, the church is the Lord's, it's not ours. But then we just take it back daily and we want to be known and we want to be seen and we want to be praised and patted on the back. And those struggles, they're probably not going away anytime soon, this side of perfection and this side of eternity. But it's true. Like if we say that the church truly is the Lord's, that he builds his church, and he's in charge of it and it's his bride. Yeah, it's hard to say that with integrity and then in the next moment be like, yeah, but I want to be seen as the guy.
Matt, can I tell a funny story real quick?
Please do.
It connects to one of the guests you've had on recently. So I had the opportunity when I was still in North Carolina. I was a part of the Summit Church has a collaborative that they do to train church planters up, and I was a part of that collaborative for the year before we planted. And they brought in author John Mark Comer. I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with John Mark Comer. And they brought John Mark Comer in to do some teaching with us. And it's a small group. There's only 6 of us. So we had a real cool opportunity to sit around a table. And this was right after he had written the Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. And so, I was thinking about a lot of the patterns and habits that we had set up in our life to Sabbath and then thinking about like just the general dynamic of church planting and how, you kind of look at just the track record of guys who planted churches and the burnout and all that kind of stuff. And so I just asked John Mark, I just said, hey, look, I firmly believe in everything that you've kind of outlined and the way that you've kind of articulated how the Bible calls us to these rhythms of life. But I was like, we're all about to plant churches. And it seems like the two kind of collide in the way that, at least the church planting culture in the West articulates it. And I just said, like, how would you plant a church in a healthy way? And his basic answer was that to do it meaningfully in team. And he said, the best example I have is this guy who just planted out in Vancouver with a team of, 5 other guys, and that was Jason Ballard. And so it was cool because I got an opportunity to talk to Jason about that. And the idea, it was like planting meaningfully in team, not just like, hey, planting with some people, but because I think for us, like as a family, like I know that there's a weight that you shoulder that honestly, like I just didn't want to shoulder by myself, not just responsibility wise, but to be able to have that, to be able to be healthy, like in the life season that we're in, with the kids in the life stage that, I just knew like we had to do this meaningfully in team, and so like what Chad said, like I wouldn't necessarily advocate that this is like the way. And I think there's a lot of things about it that make it very complicated, very sanctifying. But in terms of just like planting and being healthy, I don't really know how else you do that.
I think the principle applies that even if you are in a position of being the solo, like lead elder, planting a church, you're wise to raise up leaders around you quickly. And we've been talking about this on the podcast actually quite a bit recently, which is when you raise up leaders around you, things might be, using the term less efficient, meaning you're not just making the decision quickly and you move forward, but the overall health of the church will be better in the long haul because multiple people are contributing towards the vision and mission of the church. And each of those people will come with a perspective and leaning into their relationship with Jesus and listening for what might be and likely is the best thing for the church in the long haul. And so I'm assuming, I mean, if we could put a percentage on it, it'd be fascinating. I'm sure there's a way to do that, but you guys probably have to spend maybe 10 to 15% more related to time to do this together. But the end result of not only how you are living, but what is also being emulated to your church family is likely much better and more sustainable. Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
I would hope so.
Yeah, 100%.
I agree with the input part. Yeah, it definitely, we just got done meeting for, we every other Thursday meet for 3 hours. There's just a lot of that,
Mhm.
but I would hope that it would translate, to their people and they would see that.
So you've spoken both to the value of team, but what would be your encouragement? And just to give you maybe a bit of a picture of someone who might be listening, they are a solo lead planter. They're covo or bivocational. They're not doing it full time. Their capacity to actually bring someone else along maybe seems like more of an uphill climb. What would be your encouragement to them connected to team, that even if it seems like an uphill battle, bring other people in pretty quickly?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple conversations here. Our situation is unique in the sense, like, because what you're talking about is, I think, team dynamic, where if somebody's already out of the gate and they're planting, it's very difficult at that stage to move into a model like we're doing. And I think you're saying more like to build a team around them so they're not alone, which we have a team, but the uniqueness here is like the co-leadership that we have at the top level, to use that organizational language. But for a co-vocational planter that's really trying to shoulder everything alone, yeah, I mean, to that person, I would just say, like, that's not like the healthiest way, and it's not like the biblical way, I think, to build a church. And I just think Jeremy was alluding to it before in his response, like it's a lot more work on the front end, but like shouldering that responsibility together, like when we go home at night, like I don't feel that the entire ministry is on my shoulders, and I'm sure he doesn't either. Like, it feels like I've got this person that is in lockstep, and there's no issue going on in the ministry that he doesn't know and that I don't know, and that we're like bearing that load together. So I just think to have that, and so if you're a co-vocational planter and you're doing it alone and you're just trying to carry everything, I just think too, you're just extremely limited in what your ministry can do and accomplish, because it's all resting on your gifts, which are very, they're a single set of gifts. Like, God has gifted people with different abilities, and that's, one of the reasons I would say biblically we're to plant in team and to use the body of Christ, like Ephesians talks about. So I know there's a lot there, but I just think it's extremely limiting to think that it's just going to rest on your ability. But at the same time, there needs to be like an extremely like death to self. I mean, it's just, you no longer get to make all the decisions. And in order to lead in team effectively, you're going to have to lay that down, the idea that you're in charge and that you get to make the decisions and that the final buck stops with you. So that requires also like a real self-awareness, a real spiritual maturity. And I think that only comes, well, obviously comes by God's grace as he refines us, but it comes through like a lot of ministry experience. So that's the other piece that we won't probably go into today, but like, I think to do that well, it's going to be tough for a young leader to do that. And I think one of the things that God has gifted Jeremy and I with is, we've been in ministry for a while. We've seen quite a bit of stuff that way, and God has refined us to the point where I know I could not have done this 10 years ago.
I think the principle of, and what the scriptures share with us and teach us, is that even if somebody is a solo planter, regardless of if they're bivocational or co-vocational, it is the way that God has designed his church to be led by a plurality of leaders. And there may be someone that is the first among equals, but the goal 15 years in is not for one person still to be leading everything, but in time to be assessing, training, raising up disciples who will make disciples who then become the future leaders of the church. What is both of your vision for Halifax, Atlantic Canada, and Canada? Jeremy, I'd love to ask you this question because as I think one thing that's been beautiful coming from your story is the reality that you came from a structure of a healthy church that had a vision of multiplication. And then Chad, you spent a lot of time down at Mercy Hill, learning more of the culture, learning how Jeremy and his wife had been kind of shaped. How is that vision now impacting Port City Church and then Port City's vision for the city and region of Halifax, Nova Scotia, Atlantic Canada, and then Canada broadly?
Yeah, I mean, again, I feel like I'm in a season where I feel a bit like sheepish to speak for Atlantic Canada, just with, how long I've been here or lack thereof. But I think looking at what God is doing in this region, particularly who he's bringing here, historically Atlantic Canada has been a place, it's been a stopping place on the way to Toronto, or cities further west of us. That's not the case anymore. And so you have a lot more university students. And of course, we have, major universities here between Dalhousie and St. Mary's. And, you have a lot more university students that are staying here after they graduate. You have a lot of internationals that are coming and staying here. And so I think it expands the vision. The opportunity now that we have in this region, in our city in particular, to actually be a church that multiplies, both multiplies disciples and then multiplies congregations. And, we want to multiply everything in our church, groups, gatherings, like all of it. To be a church that does that, like I think the opportunities now abound in Atlantic Canada. It's the same, even, we think about a province like Prince Edward Island that's only 140,000 people. The same thing, they're just seeing an influx of people. And so, whereas maybe historically, and Chad could speak to this more accurately, some of that vision felt capped, because of just kind of the nature and demographic of who's here. I feel like that lid is kind of blown off now. And you look around and see the opportunity. It creates a vision where it's not hard to believe that multiplication not only is possible, but really should be happening based on growth and who's here. So,
yeah, and for you, Chad, you've been in Atlantic Canada for longer. And so as Port City has gotten started, as you guys are talking about both present and future, always dependent on what God will do. What are some of the thoughts you have as far as the impact in Halifax, Atlantic Canada, and then across the country?
There's an age-old saying here that if you're from away, you're never from here, and traditionally ideas, philosophies, thoughts that are from away, that are, from other parts of Canada or the US have been rejected, kind of like a have-not kind of mentality. That's really shifting and changing for the better. But I think one of the things, back to your original question, that I think God has allowed us to be a part of is, the experience that Jeremy's had at Mercy Hill. I served at a church called Westside Church in downtown Vancouver for many years. And I think God really equipped us, to have certain perspectives and ideas that I think were just his providence to bring those back into the Atlantic region, particularly Halifax. And so at his right, perfect timing, in a city that's much more open to those changes and those ideas. And I think we're seeing that in the life of Port City Church, and just that people are much more open to that. And that I think there's a level there of vision and implementation that I don't think I'll speak for myself. I don't think I would have received if I hadn't spent those years away. And so I'm just really, really thankful for that. When you kind of look at your own storyboard, it's like, yeah, Lord, that makes so much sense that I would be there and serve there, but yet I'm from Atlantic Canada and you called me back home. And it's just like, it's like when you go away in the military for boot camp. Boot camp is to prepare you for the real deal. And in some ways it was a lot like that. So, yeah, I don't know if that was kind of an answer to your question directly. You can feel free to re-ask it if we didn't hit it.
No, I think that's really helpful. I think something else that's worth sharing about the testimony or what you guys are doing there that is also really meaningful is that when you started and launched, you had a pastoral resident already with you. And then you also had another person serving with you in full-time staff through a funding gift that allowed that person to give emphasis to students at St. Mary's University, a few at Dal, and then also with youth. So I think what I am at least seeing, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but yes, you guys are leading in team as the co-lead elders of the church, but you're also quickly raising up other people around you to also be part of the team. And now you've just brought on a resident from Nigeria, if that stands correctly. So just as we kind of move to our close here, again, think of somebody that might be listening to this podcast who's a planter, part of a church planting team, someone in a church, someone who's already currently serving as a pastor in a church. What would be your parting or your closing words to them based on the emphasis of leading in team and also some of the ups and downs of your learning so far?
Yeah, I mean, I think to steal a page from Paul Tripp's parenting book, one of the things that has been most impactful for me in terms of parenting, which is not the question you asked, but I'll get there, is just his perspective. Like, man, it can be so easy in parenting to get sidetracked by the day-to-day. And I think the same can be true in church planting. I think it can be so easy when you're in, whether it's co-vocationally, whether you're full-time, whether you're just a lay leader, like sometimes we can get so myopic and get so trapped in the day-to-day and we lose sight of the long view. And, I would just encourage whoever that would be, like, don't get trapped in whatever it is. If you're like, I don't have a leadership team, or, I don't feel like I'm as gifted in preaching because I haven't done this, whatever that may be, or we have this pastoral issue that's in front of us. Like, don't get sucked into the vortex of the day to day. Be able to, at least at some point, take a step back, whether it's daily or at least weekly, and just remind yourself of the long view that hopefully God has you in this for the next decade, 2, 3, 4 decades. And today is a blip, but man, you got a lot more ministry ahead of you. So take the long view.
And for you, Chad?
Yeah, I think to build on that, like, how does one take the long view? How does one play the long game? I mean, that's the big question in ministry today, is like to not be taken out either by sin or by exhaustion or by hitting the wall. I mean, and then our answer to that is like, I mean, obviously there's the practices that we need, whether that's our time with Jesus, Sabbath, reading, all those types of things, silence. But just on a practical level, if you're going to think about the long game, it's not possible, I think, alone. So again, going back to this conversation of planting in team, that's one of the reasons, in our first year of ministry, we can take multiple weeks off in the summer for vacation. It's just a really practical example of like, how does one do that in a fast growing ministry, when you've got a lot of people and you're alone? That's just really, really difficult. We're planting in team and we're able to take the time that is needed to make sure that we're resting. And you have that accountability. Jeremy and I are often saying, like, how are you feeling? How are you doing? Do you need 2 or 3 days off? Do you need to slip away? So there's just those practical things that when you plant in team, it allows you or affords you to set yourself up in a healthy way. And I just don't think the Lord wants ministry to be everything in our lives. There's more to life than pastoral ministry. And I think that's really, really important that pastors have hobbies and relationships outside of ministry and are able to do those things. And so I think all of that has to do with just leading long term and leading healthily.
Friends, I'm sure you'd agree that there is much from this conversation with Chad and Jeremy that we could apply as this episode's action step. The thing that I want to emphasize, however, is when Jeremy talked about the personal sacrifice of his name and face not being the name and face of the organization. I think if many of us are honest, we like the fact, if we are the planters or the primary leader, that our name and face is the primary name and face of the organization, even to our church's detriment. And so I want to invite you to be thinking and praying about, even spending some time journaling about what would be the healthiest thing for your church moving forward. Maybe you don't have another person that you can lead with, but as we've talked about repeatedly on this podcast, we're called to make disciples that grow up into becoming leaders. And so they will, Lord willing, be the future leaders of your church. And so I want to invite you to begin really praying and thinking about co-leadership in your congregation and in your church. Maybe for those of you that have yet to plant, maybe this conversation opened up a whole new arena for you to think about co-leading with somebody else when you go to plant, not needing to be the sole name and face of that church and of your organization. Maybe you're someone who's part of a local church and you don't see co-leadership or team leadership within the context of your church. What's a way that you could bring that idea to the table for your current church leader? As Chad and Jeremy both attested to, they believe that what they've pursued in team leadership has actually been for the health of themselves and for the health of Port City Church. Well, friends, as always, thanks for joining us for this episode of the Sowers Podcast. If you were encouraged, challenged, inspired, please go ahead and share this episode with somebody else. And here, friends, now is a clip from my conversation next week with Earl Marshall.
There's definitely room for the standing in front of the room and teaching a class to people. There is information that people need, but if they just get the information, they're just going to get fat heads, right? Their heads are too fat. And really the Lord wants, you got to have time where you can go make sure their heart's connecting to that information and make sure they're growing in their skill set and their competency so that they're being prepared for the God to use them in certain ways.